She's no one's property. Not yours. Not mine. Not ever again.
I am done running. This is my land.
The cowboy drew his blade. One more mark on her. I warned you, and I'll cut you down before you take another breath. The cowboy drew his blade. One more mark on her. I warned you, and I'll cut you down before you take another breath. Apache Springs, New Mexico Territory, July 1879. In the relentless grip of a New Mexico Territory summer in July 1879, the sun was a vengeful eye, baking the mesas into hot iron and turning the wind into a rasping breath. For 3 long days, Caleb Ward had been running, the red dust of the desert caked to his boots, and a past he couldn't outrun clinging to him. He was a ghost in a landscape of ghosts. A Union deserter who had traded his uniform for the tattered coat of a man on the run. His only company, the memory of a general's order. He'd refused to carry out an order to ride against women and children. This wasn't the flight of a coward, but of a man who found honor in defiance. Yet now he was adrift and alone, a hollowed-out vessel with no port in sight. Just as the sun began its slow descent, he stumbled, the madness of thirst ringing in his ears, until a sound cut through the haze, a muffled, human cry. It was a sound too fragile for this unforgiving land, and it pulled him forward against his will. Pushing through a thicket of creosote, he found her, a Chiricahua Apache woman, bound and beaten, abandoned in the open like a discarded possession. Her wrists were seared by rawhide ropes, a blood-soaked cloth was tied over her eyes, and a single, ugly trail of crimson marked her temple. The ground around her told a grim story in a ledger of careless boot heels, a brutal testament to a dozen men who had passed this way. Sure, no one would follow. A familiar, burning rage tightened Caleb's throat. He drew his knife, not to fight, but to save, sawing at the knots with hands that had once held a saber with deadly certainty. As he peeled the blindfold away, her eyes opened dark, steady, and unflinching, a defiant fire in a body bruised by cruelty. This was no victim, but a survivor. And in the space of a single, silent glance, a fragile, unspoken connection flickered between them. He had run from bloodshed, only to find himself standing in its aftermath. He had refused to kill, only to stumble upon a cruelty worse than death itself. The slow, calculated murder of a spirit. He knew her attackers were slavers, a blight on the territory who preyed on the vulnerable, and in that moment, Caleb realized his flight was over. He had found a reason to stop running, a new purpose forged in the crucible of this merciless desert. He wasn't a hero, but he could be a guardian, and in the face of this injustice, the path forward became terrifyingly clear. She lay in the open, as if the desert itself had abandoned her. The hunger sharpened her cheeks, and willpower burned in the set of her jaw. For a long second, the desert itself seemed to pause, the way it does when a storm is deciding whether to break. "It's all right," Caleb rasped, his voice rusted from disuse. "I won't hurt you." He tipped his canteen. She drank, never looking away from his hands, watching for lies. The West strips a man down to what's real. Maybe it did the same to promises. When he eased her up, her body trembled with exhaustion but did not fold. Together they moved into a country that kept its mercy hidden, a soldier without a flag, and a woman without a name yet. Caleb's mind reeled as they staggered forward. He was a wanted man, a deserter branded by the Union as a coward. He had risked everything to avoid bloodshed, and yet here he was, staring at its raw aftermath. He had seen scenes like this too many times, the brutal signatures of men who saw native women as prey to be hunted. The rawhide burns on her wrists told their own story, one he knew too well. Slavers, the most venomous vipers in the territory. They hunted Apache and Navajo women to sell into the brothels of mining towns, where gold fever made men believe anything could be bought. The irony cut him to the bone. He had refused to kill, only to stumble upon a cruelty worse than death, the slow murder of a spirit. The woman faltered. Caleb caught her before she fell. She weighed so little that he feared the desert might simply lift her away. Her buckskin dress, once finely beaded, was torn and streaked with dirt. Bruises bloomed along her arms, reminders of the struggle she had fought before being overpowered. Rage stirred in him, old and familiar, but sharper now. This was his chance. Maybe his only chance. He could stop running. He could fight for something that mattered. He could seize redemption not in battle, but in protection. She lifted her gaze, her dark eyes searching him with a silent question. She had no past he could see, and he had too much of one. But in that silence, something fragile flickered between them, a recognition of survival. By dusk he had led her to a hidden crack in the red rock face, a narrow cleft that opened into a cave cool as a blessing. It was a place only someone who'd ridden this desert too long would know. He laid her down on moss, dampened by a spring seep, moving with the care of a man handling something sacred. He fetched water cupped in his palms, cleaning the blood from her temple, washing grit from the rope burns. His hands, once calloused by saber and rifle, now moved with the hesitant tenderness of a healer. He whispered without meaning to, "Easy now, you're safe." She winced when his fingers brushed her temple, but she did not pull away. The fire in her eyes was undimmed. Caleb thought of the general who had barked orders like death sentences, of the men who obeyed, of the children who never saw another sunrise. And here was this woman, her body broken but her spirit unbent. He saw not only her pain but also the ember of defiance that refused to die. That ember lit something in him. He had thought himself hollow, but the hollow had room enough for fire. As twilight thickened, his gaze fell on a small leather pouch tucked into her waistband. Worn smooth with use, it seemed out of place against her ragged dress. He reached for it without thinking. She flinched, clutching it, eyes wide with fear. Caleb froze, pulling back at once. "Forgive me," he said softly. "Yours, not mine." She said nothing, only tightened her grip. But her silence was not distrust alone, it was survival. She had learned the cost of placing faith in strangers. Caleb bowed his head, a soldier humbled before a survivor stronger than he. Night dropped over the basin, the sky ablaze with stars. Caleb sat at the cave mouth, rifle balanced across his knees, his eyes sweeping the horizon. He was a sentinel again, but no longer for an army's cause, for hers, for theirs. Behind him, her steady breathing echoed in the cave, proof that the desert had not claimed her. He realized, with a weight that felt like grace, that he had found a reason to fight again. The stars wheeled above, indifferent and eternal. Yet to Caleb, each one burned like a promise, of a day he had not earned but might still reach. He was no longer just a man fleeing his past. He was a guardian, perhaps even a man with a future. In the cool dark, as the crickets sang and the desert wind whispered through stone, Caleb Ward, the deserter, the outcast, the ghost in a tarnished coat, discovered something he had not thought possible, a path back. And beside him, though they had exchanged no names, a woman whose spirit refused to bow. Together, they were two shadows on the edge of a vast and merciless land. But in the space between them, fragile as dawn, there flickered the first light of trust. Chunghai. The canyon floor was a cool canvas of shadow and rock when Caleb and Aiyana began their journey. The air in the early hours was crisp and thin, smelling of juniper resin and the deep, ancient stillness of old stone. The canyon walls, rising like broken cathedrals of red sandstone, held the morning chill, even as sunlight began to claw its way down into the basin. Aiyana walked ahead, her footsteps soundless, her body poised with the quiet dignity of one who belonged to this land. She was the daughter of the desert, her senses tuned to every ripple in the wind, every faint claw mark in the sand, every distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Caleb followed her, and though he was taller, broader, the trained body of a soldier lingering beneath his ragged coat, he moved clumsily in comparison. His maps, his compass, all the tools that once defined his world, they were useless here. This country obeyed no ink lines on paper, no numbers scratched in brass. It was a land that spoke in whispers only the native-born could understand, and Aiyana understood. She read the tracks of jackrabbits like scripture, knew where to find water hidden in stone hollows, knew which thorned plants could feed a starving body and which would poison it. Caleb, for all his years of discipline, found himself humbled. "Still ridin' with us, partner? Drop a flood of 1 second and your place in the comments if you love Wild West love stories on the Wild West Love channel." They were an unlikely pair, a soldier with a broken oath and a woman who had refused to break. Their language was silence, punctuated by glances and small gestures. She would nod toward a bush, and he would see berries he would have walked past. He would lift his rifle, angle it in his hands, and she would learn curious, cautious, how to hold the weapon that had so often been turned against her people. The first time she fired it, the crack rolled through the canyon like thunder. Her body absorbed the recoil with fluid grace, her eyes narrowing as the bullet splintered a distant branch. Caleb almost smiled. "You're a natural," he said. She only shrugged, her gaze unreadable, though a small flicker of pride betrayed her stillness. Days passed in a rhythm of survival and wary companionship. In the shade of a massive rock overhang one afternoon, with the heat pressing like a hand on their backs, Caleb finally let words spill from the place he had kept them locked. His voice was hoarse, the confessions dragging out like stones. He told her of the general who had lied, of the order to ride against women and children. He told her of the night he walked away from his own brothers in arms, branded a deserter, hunted as a coward. He told her of the blood that stained him still, ghosts that visited in his dreams, whispering names he could not forget. "I thought honor meant obedience," he said bitterly, staring at the dust between his boots. "But honor is nothing in the mouths of liars. I chose to refuse, and in doing so, I lost everything. I'm a hero in a world that has no place for heroes, just a ghost dragging itself through the desert." Aiyana listened. She did not interrupt. Her dark eyes were deep pools, reflecting not judgment, but an understanding carved from her own wounds. When he finished, when the silence weighed heavier than the confession itself, she reached out and laid her hand over his. The gesture was small, almost tentative, but to Caleb it was a bridge. She had no words, perhaps she had none to give, but she gave something greater: witness. For the first time, he felt seen not as a soldier, not as a criminal, but as a man carrying unbearable sorrow. That night, as they lay in the shelter of the overhang, the firelight flickering against the red stone, Caleb thought, perhaps this is what it means to begin again, not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, but the simple act of being understood. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 mornings later. The sky was a flat, pitiless blue, and the wind carried the stench of smoke. They crested a low rise and stumbled into the aftermath of a raid. A family man, woman, and child lay sprawled in the dust, their bodies twisted in death's cruel angles. The woman's wrists were scored with rope burns. The child's eyes were still open, staring at the sky that had never answered his cries. Caleb's gut turned to stone. He knelt, his hands shaking as he brushed dust from the boy's face. "God forgive them," he muttered, though he no longer believed in gods that listened. The brutality was too familiar, the handiwork of slavers whose trade was misery. He noticed a peculiar detail. The men had worn strips of faded blue sash tied at their shoulders, a sign that lingered from the war, a grim calling card. Aiyana dropped to her knees beside the woman. Her face, carved with sorrow yet set in iron, did not crumble. She had seen too much to weep. She pried gently at the woman's stiffened fingers and found, clutched tight, a small embroidered pouch. With deliberate movements, she opened it. Inside lay a single piece of parchment, worn at the edges, ink smudged by sweat. A hand-drawn map. Aiyana slid the embroidered pouch and its ledger map into her own leather pouch, pressing it to her ribs, as if it were a heartbeat. Her eyes narrowed. The symbols, crude but purposeful, traced the canyons and riverbeds of this land. Not a treasure map, Caleb realized as he looked over her shoulder, but a ledger, a network, a record of where the slavers moved, where they struck, where they sold. Aiyana's gaze hardened to steel. For weeks she had lived with no memory of her own family, no past she could cling to. But now purpose filled the hollow. This map was not just paper, it was the thread of vengeance, of justice, perhaps even of her redemption. A memory flickered in her mind, a woman's voice echoing a name she had not heard in years. Aiyana. It was her name, a name forgotten and now found. Caleb saw the fire alight in her eyes. He recognized it, for it was the same blaze that once drove him to defy a general. She rose to her feet, clutching the pouch against her chest. When she turned to him, she did not need to speak. Her eyes said it all. "This is the path. This is what we fight for." He nodded slowly, the weight of his rifle heavier now, not as a burden but as a promise. "Then we go where it leads," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. That evening, as the sun bled red across the canyon walls, Caleb watched her silhouetted against the horizon. She looked less like a survivor and more like a warrior rising from the ashes of grief. For the first time, she was not simply a woman without a name. She was a woman with a purpose. Aiyana. In the dusty towns he'd passed through, he'd heard whispers of a monster who wore a tarnished eagle pin, a man they simply called the General, who ran the cruel network of human traffic. He knew now who they were up against. In the silence of the desert, beneath the gathering stars, Caleb understood. Her fight was now his fight. Her story was one he would help write. They were no longer just two broken souls drifting through the wilderness. They had become something else, two blades, sharpened by suffering, set against a darkness that thrived on silence. The canyon floor that had begun their journey was no longer just shadow and stone. It was the threshold of a war neither had chosen but both would embrace. A soldier who had fled his oath, and an Apache woman robbed of her past, now shared a singular truth. The only way forward was through fire. And so their story, tragic and fierce, was only beginning. Chungba, the peaceful sanctuary of the canyon, was gone. What once had been a cathedral of stone and silence now trembled with a nervous energy, a tightness in the air that pressed against the skin and made even the shadows feel hostile. The cool echo of dripping water in the crevice had been replaced by the hiss of unseen movement in the brush, the faint shuffle of boots against loose gravel. Caleb and Aiyana, no longer just survivors clinging to chance, had become something else, warriors preparing for a war they had not chosen. It had come to them like a curse, like a ghost carried on the wind. The slavers had found them, not the ragged, half-starved bands that drifted from town to town in search of coin, but an organization, a machine of cruelty that stretched across territories, feeding on human lives as cattlemen fed on the flesh of bison. At its head was the figure known only as the General. His eagle insignia, once brass bright with patriotic pride, had been filed smooth, as though he no longer needed even the pretense of honor. A puckered scar, the color of dried clay, carved his face from ear to jaw. His men wore strips of faded blue sash knotted at their shoulders, as if the war had never ended, as if the bloodletting of the 1,862nd still burned in their marrow. The standoff began not with gunfire, but with silence. The general's men were wolves, patient and deliberate. They did not storm the canyon. They circled it, hemming it in with slow precision, their presence announced only by the occasional glint of steel in the sun or the soft cough of dust stirred under a boot heel. Caleb recognized the tactic immediately. They were applying pressure, waiting for panic to split the cracks in their defenses. They meant to bleed spirit before they drew blood, but they did not know Aiyana. They did not know that she, though robbed of her memory, carried within her veins the ancient instinct of a people older than the canyons themselves. They did not know Caleb, not the deserter who had run from a war's command, but the man who had been reshaped by loss into someone willing to stand, rifle in hand, for one soul who had given him back his own. The general was no man of honor now. Once decorated, once followed, he had rotted into something monstrous. He had traded conscience for coin, duty for greed, morality for the cold arithmetic of supply and demand. To him, human beings were merchandise, native women stolen for brothels, children bartered in shadowed saloons, men broken into slaves of the mines. His reputation for cruelty was no rumor. It was carved in the graves he left behind. And now he hunted Aiyana. She was valuable, yes, but more dangerous than her value was her truth. She had seen his men. She had survived their ropes. She was living evidence of his brutality. He wanted her silenced, forever. Caleb stood on the canyon's highest ridge, rifle pressed against his shoulder, eyes sweeping the horizon where shadows crept like stains across the desert floor. He counted 6, no, 7 figures slipping between the rocks. They were waiting, testing. He tightened his grip until the wood creaked. "I've seen this before," he muttered, half to himself, half to the wind. "They're closing the noose." Aiyana appeared at his side, silent as a wisp of smoke. Her hand brushed his arm not to comfort, but to steady. Her gaze swept the ridges with the sharpness of a hawk's. She understood the map in her hand, not just as lines on paper, but as the ghost of their movements, a prediction of their next strike. "They think we are prey," she said, her voice low, her accent rolling like water over stone. "They forget the canyon has teeth." Her words settled in him like iron. But the general had not come alone. At his side walked a figure Caleb had hoped never to see. An Apache tracker, once renowned for his skill, now hollowed out by drink and betrayal. His name had been stripped from him, sold for a bottle, whispered away in shame. His people called him nothing now but a ghost. He was the one who had led them here, his feet reading the earth like scripture, his broken honor guiding the very men who devoured his kin. Aiyana sensed him before Caleb spoke of it. She knelt, studying the ground, her fingers brushing faint depressions in the sand. The tracks were too clean, too deliberate. A man who wanted to be unseen, yet could not help but leave the signature of mastery behind. Her chest tightened. She rose slowly, eyes dark with a sorrow she could not explain. "He's here," she whispered. "The ghost. He has found us." Caleb's jaw clenched. He remembered nights around campfires, back when the war had not yet eaten everything, hearing tales of this man, how he could follow a rider across bare rock, how he could smell rain in the bones of the earth. To see him here, broken, in the service of a butcher, was a cruelty almost worse than the noose tightening around them. That night, they made no fire. The canyon was dark, its walls echoing with the faint sound of shifting stone as men crept into position. Caleb and Aiyana crouched in the blackness, their breaths shallow, their hands brushing as they readied weapons. "You could still leave," Caleb murmured, his voice barely audible. "Slip through the cracks in the rocks. They want you, not me." Her eyes turned on him, fierce and steady. "I am done running," she said. "This is my land. These are my mountains. If I leave now, I will never find myself again." He swallowed. He wanted to argue, but he saw in her eyes the truth of it. She was not a prisoner anymore. She was not a nameless survivor. She was Aiyana, and she would not surrender. The words came out before he could stop them. "Then we fight together." Dawn broke harsh and red. The general rode forward at last, mounted on a bay horse scarred by whip and spur. His scar glowed like fire in the sunrise. He raised one hand, and the circle of his men tightened. "Ward!" His voice carried through the canyon, thick with arrogance. "You've run long enough. You think you can play the savior now? You think you can hide my property?" His laughter echoed, cruel and hollow. "Hand her over, and I might let you live." Caleb stepped forward, rifle leveled, his boots grinding into stone. His voice cracked, but it carried. "She's no one's property, not yours, not mine, not ever again." The canyon swallowed his words and threw them back. Aiyana stood behind him, her posture tall, her eyes burning. She said nothing, but the set of her shoulders spoke louder than any words. The general sneered. "Then you'll both die here," and with a flick of his hand, the wolves descended. The canyon exploded with sound. Gunfire cracked, echoing off the stone walls like thunder. Dust and rock burst into the air. Caleb's rifle spoke once, twice, 3 times, dropping shadows as they rushed. Aiyana moved with terrifying grace, her borrowed rifle steady, each shot true. She fought not as a victim, but as a warrior reborn. The ghost tracker appeared at the canyon's edge, his eyes wild, his face hollow. For a heartbeat, his gaze locked with Aiyana's. Something unspoken passed between them, pity, regret, the echo of what might have been. Then he vanished into the dust, a shadow among shadows. Caleb reloaded, his hands slick with sweat. The general loomed at the far ridge, a dark figure commanding the storm. Caleb knew this was more than survival now. This was reckoning. This was the war he had tried to leave behind, dragged to his doorstep by the man who had first stolen his soul. But this time, he did not fight for a flag. This time, he fought for her. And as the canyon walls shook with fury, Caleb Ward discovered that love, sharpened by loss and bound in blood, could be the fiercest weapon of all. Chungbon. The standoff had stretched into a brutal game of patience and psychological warfare. Days bled into nights, and nights into a silence so thick it felt like a third presence in the canyon. The general's men, that motley pack of mercenaries and slave traders, ringed the red rock walls like vultures circling carrion. They did not rush in with gunfire or fury. Instead, they let their cruelty seep in slowly, a poison drawn out over hours. They sent taunts riding the wind, mocking laughter, shouted promises of what they would do to Aiyana once she was theirs again. The sound of their voices, cruel and hungry, bounced from cliff to cliff until it seemed the canyon itself mocked them. But Caleb and Aiyana did not break. They sat in the shadows together, shoulder to shoulder, their breath shallow but steady. They had endured too much to surrender to words. What had begun as two lost souls adrift in the desert had hardened into something unshakable. Caleb, the soldier who had abandoned a false cause, and Aiyana, the woman who had risen from her own ashes, had become more than individuals. They were a team, a unit, a force sharpened by suffering and bound by love. And that love, fragile, bruised, but burning with the fire of survival, was stronger than any weapon the general's men could carry. Aiyana was the one who carried the plan in her bones. She had no memories of her past. Names, faces, family, all had been stolen from her. Yet she carried within her an ancient, unnamed knowledge, as though the land itself whispered to her. She could stand at the canyon's lip, close her eyes, and tell Caleb when the wind would shift. She could place her palm against the rock and sense hollows where echoes would fracture, places where sound became trickery. To Caleb, trained by men who trusted only maps and compasses, it was something close to magic. But to her, it was not magic, it was survival, the inheritance of a people whose blood had been poured into this land long before generals and armies claimed it. "You listen with your ears," she told him one evening, as twilight bruised the sky. "I listen with my skin. The stone carries voices, the wind carries warnings. If you listen, the canyon will fight with us." Lo! Her voice was steady, her face lit by the dying firelight, her eyes reflecting both steel and sorrow. Caleb, who once believed he had nothing left to fight for, felt a weight settle into his chest, not despair, but purpose. The general grew restless. A man like him could not stomach delay. His reputation was his lifeblood. He ruled through fear, through the certainty that no prey could escape his snare. He had built his fortune on the backs of the innocent, his network of corrupt officials and greedy traders stretching from the saloons of Apache Springs to the border towns where law meant nothing but the barrel of a gun. To him, human lives were coin. He could not, would not, afford to be made a fool by two fugitives, one a deserter, the other a woman he had already marked as broken property. From the ridge where he camped, he paced, his scarred face catching the firelight. His men watched him with wary eyes. They had seen what happened when his patience wore thin. He was not a leader. He was a predator wearing a man's skin, his honor long since hollowed out. And yet, for all his menace, there was a truth he did not see. Against him did not stand a deserter and a lost woman. Against him stood a soldier who had learned love, and a woman who had become the canyon itself. The plan was simple, but its strength lay in the land. Aiyana led Caleb along the canyon's secret veins, the routes from the map she carried now alive in her mind. The crude symbols traced on the parchment were not just a record of past movements. They were a guide to the natural choke points and hidden traps of the canyon. She showed him narrow passages where a single misstep could send a man tumbling into the void. She showed him how sound bent itself between walls, how a gunshot in the right hollow could multiply into three. She traced routes that seemed like escape, but ended in stone traps where no horse could turn. One night, crouched together in the dark, she whispered the heart of it. "We lead them where the canyon wishes. We do not fight their way. We fight ours." Her hand brushed his, her touch grounding him. He nodded. "We'll give them ghosts to chase." The trap was sprung on the third dawn. The general's men had pressed closer, their circle drawing tight, their jeers echoing across the stone. Aiyana and Caleb lured them, step by step, using the map to guide them, leaving signs meant to be followed, broken brush, boot prints scattered like crumbs. The wolves took the bait, their confidence swelling as they drove their prey deeper into the labyrinth of red rock. At last, the canyon narrowed into a dead end, walls rising sheer and high, no escape but the way they had come. The mercenaries slowed, puzzled, their mutters bouncing nervously in the confined space. Aiyana lifted her rifle. She waited, every nerve tuned to the wind. Then, as the breeze shifted north, she fired once into the fluted wall. The sound shattered, splitting into 3 false reports that ricocheted across the cliffs. The men panicked, firing into shadows that did not exist. "Now," she hissed. Caleb drove his bayonet under a cairn, prying loose the keystone of a shelf above. With a groan like the canyon itself awakening, a slab of rock broke free. The avalanche roared down, choking the chute behind the mercenaries, sealing them in with a thunder of stone. Dust filled the air, thick and suffocating. From the high ridge above, Aiyana's voice rang out. It was not the cry of a victim, it was the voice of the canyon itself, triumphant and defiant. "Surrender!" Her shout echoed, fractured, multiplied, until it seemed the very mountains roared with her. The general's men were trapped, their escape route gone, their advantage crushed under rock and echo. They stumbled, coughing, firing blindly at cliffs that mocked them with every returning sound. Caleb stood at Aiyana's side, rifle steady. His face was pale with dust, his eyes burning. He glanced at her, and saw not the woman he had cut free from ropes weeks ago, but a warrior scarred, unbroken, radiant with fire. "They came for a treasure," he said, voice rough, "but the canyon kept it for itself." Line. Aiyana's gaze never left the chaos below. "They came for a victim," she answered, her voice low and certain. "But they found a warrior." And as the sun broke free of the horizon, spilling red gold across the canyon walls, Caleb knew the truth. Whatever the outcome, whatever blood still had to be shed, they had already won. Because the canyon, the desert, and their love had bound them into something no general could ever buy, break, or bury. 2 souls had become one force, and that force was unstoppable. Chungnam, the confrontation was not a battle. It was a surrender. The canyon, that red stone cathedral of echoes and secrets, lay quiet after the storm. Dust still floated in the air, shimmering in the last ribbons of light, settling slowly as if reluctant to admit that violence had ended. The general stood in the center of it all, stripped of the aura that had once made hardened men tremble at his command. His tarnished brass insignia no longer glinted. It looked like nothing more than scrap metal on a ruined man's coat. His scar, running jagged from ear to jaw, had lost its menace, appearing now like a wound that had never healed, a brand of failure carved into flesh. This was a man who had sold his soul for power, who had built his fortune on the backs of the innocent, who had bartered away honor for cruelty. And yet here he stood, defeated, not by a bullet, not by sheer force of arms, but by something his arsenal had no defense against: spirit. He had lost to a ghost. He had lost to the canyon itself, and perhaps worst of all, he had lost to the one treasure he could never own, never trade, never purchase honor. Aiyana stood opposite him, rifle cradled against her chest, the last rays of sunlight painting her face in copper and gold. The woman who had once staggered in the dust with rawhide burns and blood drying on her temple was gone. In her place stood a warrior. Her memory, fractured and hidden for so long, had come back piece by piece during the fight. She remembered faces now: her mother's laugh, the warmth of a fire circle, the drums that carried stories through the night. She remembered her name, spoken not as a whisper but as a promise: Aiyana. And with her memory came her voice. She was no longer a ghost wandering the desert. She was a woman who had been broken, but never destroyed. A woman who had lost everything, and yet found something greater: love that burned fiercer than any weapon. She was a woman who carried both the weight of her people's sorrow and the fierce hope of their survival. She had found her purpose, her reason to fight, her reason to live. Caleb watched her, and for the first time in years, He did not feel like a deserter. He was not the man who had run from the Union flag, nor the man who had drowned in guilt. He was not a coward anymore. Standing in the shadow of Aiyana's fire, he felt remade. He was no longer a soldier, but a protector. No longer a ghost, but a man who had been given a second chance. He had found a love that tethered him back to the living, a love that taught him that guilt was not the end, only a burden to be transformed into action. In her eyes, he had found his honor again, not the false honor the generals barked about, not the kind printed on medals or written into orders, but the kind that lived in choice every small decision to protect, to shield, to stand for something more than himself. The general's men, once snarling wolves, now shuffled like beaten dogs. Their rifles lay in a pile at Caleb's boots, their revolvers stripped from holsters, their horses led away to ensure no sudden flight. They were a pack of men who had come for a treasure and left with humiliation. They had come for a woman and found a warrior. They had come for a victim and found a hero. When Caleb ordered them to walk, they did. Down the trail, away from the canyon, toward the distant hum of towns where law, however crooked, would bind them tighter than any rope. None looked back. They had seen enough of the canyon's wrath. Silence returned, though it was not peace. Victory never is. It felt more like a fever-breaking sweat, cooling, lungs aching, the salt of survival bitter on the tongue. Caleb leaned against the stone, his rifle heavy in his hands, his body trembling with the exhaustion of knowing he was still alive. Aiyana lowered herself beside him, her buckskin dress torn and bloodied, but her back straight, her eyes bright. No one cheered. There were no banners, no songs. Only the hollow quiet of a canyon that had closed its teeth once more. The desert is never a witness, never a judge. It holds its secrets close. That night, they sat together on the canyon rim where the stone thinned to the color of embers. Below them, the battlefield still smelled of gunpowder and churned dust, but above, the sky opened into fire. The sun bled copper, then wine, then bruised violet as it sank behind the mesas. It was the kind of sky that told a rider he had to choose a road. They did not speak at first. They didn't have to. The wind carried the sharp scent of creosote after heat. A nighthawk stitched the first star into the fabric of dark. Caleb's hands rested palm up on his knees, scarred hands that had both harmed and healed. Aiyana sat cross-legged, her scars silver in the fading light, her gaze steady as a river stone gleaming in shallow water. Finally, Caleb's voice cracked into the silence. "What now?" Aiyana turned her face toward the black line of the mountains far to the south, where Chiricahua fires had once burned before soldiers smothered them. "We ride," she said softly, "not away, through." They rode with the ledger map tucked close, not away but through, cutting each remaining link in the chain. If this ride lit a spark, drop a 1 and your place below. For more Wild West love stories, more Wild West love, and true blue cowboy love stories, keep riding with us.